Our next speaker, who's going to talk about irrigation, avocados need water, as all trees do, is Ben Faber.
Avocados are growing at their unnatural limit here. They really need to be growing in a cloud forest where it's perfect weather all the time. It gets pure water falling from the sky every week or almost every day. It is beautiful soil, rich, fertile, that infiltrates, never ponds. And then we come to California and it's crappy soil, crappy water, crappy climate. It's too hot, it's too cold. And management is really critical here. There are people here from Ventura who've made lots of mistakes irrigating, and you should look to them as mentors, because we had this phenomenon in Fillmore about 15 years ago when Valencia market collapsed. And so what are we going to do? Oh, we're going to plant avocados. And so they irrigated 48 hours every month. And what happened to the avocados? They died. And so now they're growing vegetables out there. So anyway, it's the most difficult crop that I work with is avocados. And an avocado grower who has happy, healthy trees is probably the best irrigator you'll ever find in California. You know, citrus growers can get away with a lot. It's deep-rooted, it's xerophilic, it can handle heat to a certain extent, it can handle cold to a certain extent. Avocados are baby bear, the Goldilocks phenomenon. It's too hot, it's too cold, it's too hard, it's too soft. It's got to be just right if you're going to have a happy avocado. So it's got a shallow root system. And so you're managing something like this. Okay. You know, you don't have 3 feet, 4 feet that can mine rainfall, the little rainfall you get here, you know, later on in the spring. You are applying the water that tree needs. It's got a very coarse root system, and it's growing in a mulch environment. And that mulch is critical for root health. It's critical for the nutrient management. You know, you may be used to applying 100, 200, 300 pounds of nitrogen per navel tree. You can grow an avocado on 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 70 pounds, because it's got this very phenomenal, efficient nutrient recycling system. It's in the roots. The roots are right into the mulch. And you scrape away, and it's moist there. It's always just the right moisture if you're managing it right. And you're never going to be able to do foliar applications with nutrients on avocados. It's got this really waxy, thick leaf. And this is a little trial I did about 3 years ago where I tagged leaves that had recently fallen, leaves that were 6 months old and a year old, with different colored polypropylene string. And these were leaves that persist for over a year. They don't rot. They just accumulate if you allow them to, if you prevent wind from blowing them away, or God forbid you go out and you scrape them up because you like the look of a lemon orchard with just nice clean floor. And it's within that mulch that you find this antagonistic environment to Phytophthora. So somebody was saying that they've got root rot. If you one of the first signs of a healthy root system is it has mulch. A healthy tree is going to create mulch, and it creates its own environment to combat mulch. And it also is creating an environment that is just right for moisture content for the roots. So the avocado is desperately in need of a mulch. And so most trees like mulch, but again, in citrus, you can get away with scraping away all those leaves. You know, those leaves get in the way, and that's where all the earwigs are and stuff like that. But you don't do that with an avocado. So these are the stages of root rot. So it goes from a healthy tree on the right side to the middle tree, which is starting to look a little peaked, and then this tree to the left, which is thinning canopy, and you see no mulch present. So the tree doesn't have enough energy to create the mulch that's going to protect the root system. So we're talking irrigation here, really. But the mulch is incredibly important in managing your irrigation. So eventually the tree dies, as you see there. Phytophthora is the menace worldwide that has people eventually have to learn to live with. And we have tools now to deal with mulch. And one of the first lines of defense is irrigation management. That is the first. So we've got clonal rootstocks that have been created to be resistant, but you can kill those just as easily with poor irrigation management. You know, there's no way around proper irrigation management. The first drip irrigation introduced into California was done by Don Gustafson in San Diego on these hillsides. He'd gone to Israel and learned how to use drip irrigation, and it made it possible to plant on the cheap land with the cheap water that was being delivered from the north. Unfortunately, a lot of those places are no longer. So we have controls for root rot. First one is proper irrigation. Next is resistant rootstocks. Mounding. If you've got any kind of clay in your soil and you're on flat ground, you want to mound. Gypsum has some impact. So the white stuff you see in the photo there is gypsum. We have fungicides. Orondus is available now. It's very effective. Phosphorus acid is available, and it's very effective. It's managed correctly. And mulch. You know, it is amazing. You can turn a tree around if you maintain the mulch or you introduce supplemental mulch. Okay, it's not registered as a pesticide, but it is. Proper irrigation management. Well, you know, it rains, and it rained this year, October, November, and we saw a collapse of avocados and citrus because it rained and it rained and it rained. And avocados are very, very susceptible to asphyxiation. Citrus is too. You know, you may not see a lot of this phenomenon, but the way Tappan talks about it, the amount of rainfall in the valley is not going to change, but the incidence, the occurrence of rain is going to be more effective. And it's, you know, if you're growing avocados on flat ground and it's not mounded, there's a good chance you're going to have asphyxiation, and it's startling. The tree just collapses. It will usually come back if you whitewash the tree, because what kills the tree then is sunburn. So you need to get a white reflective paint onto the tree to prevent sunburn after that. Botryosphaeria, Dothiorella. These are decay fungi that are present in citrus orchards. I've seen a lot of Botryosphaeria. I've seen Botryosphaeria on roses. I've seen it on peaches. I've seen it on eucalyptus. I've seen it on Brazilian pepper. And these are water stress plants. When we go into a drought situation, if you're not maintaining your mulch, and it's the decay fungi that are breaking down that mulch. So if you're growing avocados and you have mulch, and you'd better have mulch, the breakdown product that releases the nutrients that makes for a very efficient uptake of nutrients is also the fungi that cause Botryosphaeria. And so this is a disease that will go after a water-stressed tree, and it will go to the branches, it'll go to the leaves, will cause defoliation. What's that? Goes to the fruit. Yeah, it's a water-stressed tree that brings it on. And it's the fungi that are growing in the mulch that go after the tree when the tree starts going into stress. You know, this is a very common disease also in almonds and pistachios, where what do? They stress the heck out of the trees in order to go into harvest, right? To cause the nuts to fall. And so you create a water stress in a pistachio and you get Botryosphaeria. Avocados are so susceptible to salt burn, salt damage. And on the east side here, where you have this really pure water, you're probably not going to see it. But if you're growing anywhere where you've got salt in your water, and along the coast, that's all we got is salt in the water. This is a very common phenomenon. And this is probably how Botryosphaeria starts. You get salt damage, tip burn, you have a dead tissue out there, and Botryosphaeria goes after it because it's just like dead mulch on the leaf, on the mulch. So it's very susceptible to salt burn. So if you've got any salt in your water, or if you're onto a 1-month irrigation cycle, and so it goes into water stress and you get tip burn, you have to develop some kind of a leaching program in order to remove the salt from your irrigation water so it doesn't accumulate in the root zone. Citrus growers regularly interplant. And this is where you've got a tree that's died from gophers or some other disease, nematodes or something like that. And you've got nice, healthy, big trees, and you throw in a young tree, brand new tree, and usually it works. It doesn't work with avocados unless you put in a completely separate irrigation line. The big trees get what they need, and the new tree gets what it needs. And it's usually, the problem is the frequency of irrigation. Okay, the big tree can get by with irrigation once a week, once every 2 weeks, something like that. If you're in a rainy cycle, you can get by once a month maybe. But that little tree needs 5 gallons every 2 days, every 3 days, every 4 days. And the schedule is devised for the big trees. So the little tree suffers, or if you're trying to keep the little tree going, the big tree suffers. So you can't interplant avocados easily unless you create a completely separate irrigation system. And this is what sunburn looks like. And anytime you cause defoliation in the tree, botryopharia, salt burn, under irrigation, frost damage, heat damage, anytime you start losing leaves, you lose the cooling system of the tree. So water is moving from the ground into the roots, up the trunk, into the leaves, and out the leaves. And that is cooling the tree. And you remove the leaves, and water doesn't move. The exposed branches that were in the shade, with leaves protecting them, are now exposed. And you can go up to that tree, and this can happen in one day. Okay, you had a frost, you had a heat wave, defoliation. You can go up to that tree and and it's hot. It's hot. It's hot, and it's hot enough to cause sunburn. And so once you lose a canopy, you have to start thinking of going in there and whitewashing the tree to protect it. It's not the frost that kills the tree. It's not the heat wave. It's not the tip burn. It's not the botryopharia. It's the burning sun that now is going to kill the tree. Okay. Verticillium is one of these dramatic diseases. Or gophers, young tree, boom, goes down, no leaves, sunburn, and the tree dies. So this goes back to irrigation management. You've got to protect the tree, keep the water flowing through the tree in order to cool it off. This is where this Cal-Ag climate forecasting is helpful, because you have to have water moving through the tree in anticipation of the heat wave, because the tree, to protect itself, closes its stomata. So the heat wave arrives and you go, oh, I'd better turn the water on. It's too late, because the tree has closed its stomata, and you put the water on, and because the stomata aren't opening, it's not moving through the tree and cooling the tree. So you have to anticipate heat waves and get the water on. Okay, so the question is, drip effective or microsprays? California industry was about 2,000 acres in 1960. In 1975, water flowed to San Diego, and suddenly we had 20,000 acres. And 5 years later, we had 40,000. In 1990, we had close to 90,000 acres. And since then, water prices and water availability have gone down, and we're down to about 52,000 acres, something like that. And so we planted everything on Don Gustafson's drip. We're on the hillsides where cheap land was and water was out there. And people noted that as the trees got bigger and bigger and bigger, the trees started looking stunted. They looked yellow. They weren't getting enough nutrients. So they threw in micro sprinklers and boom, the trees took off again. And probably since nobody flood irrigates avocados. And nobody furrow irrigates. There's always exceptions. There's one little guy in Fort Hueneme that flood irrigates and the trees look awful. But everyone went to micro sprinklers about 1985 or so. And there's no avocado orchard that was planted after 1985 that did not have micro sprinklers. And since then, we found that inline drip, 2 lines, is as effective as micro sprinklers. And the key is you've got a shallow root system, so it's important to have a wide wetted area. Okay, so micro sprinklers will irrigate 40 to 50 to 60% of the surface area. Once water moves into the soil, it onions out and moves out and supports the rest of the root system. And so having a double line drip can do that. So we found that, as you can see in this photo, it's very common to see double line drip now. And one reason for it is that it's cheap. It works. It works especially well on berms. And early on, there's a lot less weeds than micro sprinklers. And if they're managed, yes.
And just as important to keep the trunks dry.
Oh gosh, no tree wants to have a wet trunk. None, zero. And so avocados are very susceptible to wetted trunks. They get a Phytophthora. And Phytophthora is pretty much, if you have any movement in an orchard, eventually you're going to get crown rot, which is a Phytophthora, and it's promoted. And where we have fog along the coast, you'll see fog drip and you'll see crown rot. Wherever you see a micro sprinkler hitting the tree trunk, you'll see crown rot. It's a slow acting Phytophthora, but eventually it will kill a tree, but it really will cause defoliation and a weaker canopy. Yeah. So yeah, you don't want to wet any tree trunk, and especially avocados. So this was a study done at Cal Poly San Luis, and they showed that drip versus micro sprinklers can be equally efficient if they're well maintained. So that's one of the problems. That's one of the drawbacks of drip is they clog. Inline drip tends to have a much lower potential for clogging than the button type drip. You may not have considered distribution uniformity. Every tree gets the same amount of water on an irrigation system. No. There's no such thing as every drip emitter, every micro sprinkler emitter puts out exactly the same amount on a 20 acre, 40 acre, 80 acre irrigation block. You want to have something in the order of about 80%, and that's achievable on flat ground where trees are growing on slopes, moving, rolling slopes. It's harder. There's pressure compensating emitters that are available that work if they run at the right temperature. They work if you've got good filtration and good pressure regulation. But it's really easy to see that tree's not doing really well. And you go out and you find out it's clogged or it's broken or it's on its side. Just had a harvest go through and people kick them over, or the coyotes have come through and they're chewing on the emitters. So maintaining a good DU it goes back to avocados need to be properly irrigated. You can get by with sloppy irrigation with citrus. You can't do that with avocados. And you've got to maintain the irrigation system, make sure that all the emitters are putting out a comparable amount. And this is an example of DUs of 90% and 75%. So even with a DU of 90%, that's 10% are not putting out the average. 5% are putting out more, or 5% are putting out less. So to compensate for those that are not getting enough, you run the system longer to make sure that those that are not getting enough water. So everything shifts to getting a little bit too much water. And if you've got a 75% DU where 25% are getting less than the average or more, that's when you start setting up the trees for Dothiorella, for saltburn, for root rot. And root rot is, nobody is immune from it. It will hit you eventually. Okay, a healthy tree fights it off. Any stress tree, any irrigation stress tree is now fair game for root rot, and it is a devastating disease. So here's an example of a trial that was done at a rootstock trial that was done at Cal Poly, and it's 3 irrigation blocks. Okay, 1 valve. Okay, this thing is 12 acres, and so the students went out and they measured DU at 3 sites, and they found that 2 sites that were nearest the valve were putting out about the same amount. But the trial that measured the emitters furthest from the valve were way off. And so they ended up with a DU of 0.76. So that means 24% of the valves are not putting out what the average is. So what do? You run the system longer to make sure that those that aren't getting enough water get enough water. Then the others get too much water, setting up the trees for root rot. A lot of growers down in San Diego, more so than you'll find further north, use irrigation calculator that's available at both the California Irrigation Management Information System, but also at Avocado Source. There's a tool there that growers can use. You always have to back up ET-based irrigation scheduling with soil moisture monitoring. So you got to have something in the ground, or you have to have boots on the ground looking at what is the soil moisture content, because there's a lot of variability, even on flat ground, largely because the irrigation systems are not properly maintained. So, as mentioned, in the good old days when I was hired, there were 15 days in Ventura where the orchard heaters, the smudge pots were running, and the wind machines were running, and the water was running, and we haven't had a good cold day, night in several years now. But we have had 2 major heat waves since 2020, and this is another example where mulch protects the root system. Otherwise, you're going to get burned. And we pretty much every flat ground avocado orchard now is bermed to provide better water movement. Also, it allows for better aeration, and that's always mulched, which cools the soil. We use cover crops that also cool the soil. There's been some work with anti-transperants, and so again, you have to maintain water movement through the tree, out the stomata, in order to cool the tree. An anti-transparent stops that movement. It closes the emitters. Some work was done where we looked at heat stress versus water stress, and it turns out you really want to have a reflectant. You want to have something like kaolin or a white reflectant material. The anti-transparents actually will cause hotter leaves. Okay, so there's materials like Surround and Screen Duo sunscreen that are reflectants. They're not anti-transparents that can help cool an orchard. And these have been used in walnuts as well. I talked to Graziel at the walnut guy at Davis, and these reflectants are commonly used. So we've done a lot of work with overhead emitters, cooling. This is a grower in Ojai who ran overhead emitters, and he got about 10 degrees cooling with, these are micro sprinklers. Other growers were having fruit drop. Had another grower in Santa Paula that installed micro sprinklers overhead, and he installed them both for heat control as well as frost control. He's never used it for frost control, but he's used it twice for cooling very successfully. And if you want to learn more about avocados and irrigation, we've got a blog that comes out a couple times a week. Got a quarterly newsletter. We've got Avocado Source, which is available. It's online. It's got everything you really need to know, want to know about avocado production and as well as irrigation. So are there recommendations for mulch? Compost is terrible as a mulch. It blows away anything fine. You want something coarse, woody, that is persistent, that it infiltrates well. So we're looking at something on the order of 100 tons per acre when you mulch, and you want something 2 to 3 inches in diameter. And if you think that is wonderful stuff, it is, but it is expensive as hell to apply. You know, we looked at application of mulches, and it ran anywhere from about $300 an acre if you had flat ground and the right machinery and a team going rah, 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 and you had a big enough area to do it. When you start going on to slopes, it can cost $1,500 an acre to spread it. So a coarse woody mulch is the most, that's persistent and eventually becomes very good at supporting microbial populations. Oddly enough, composts are not very reactive. You know, that's the end product. There's no carbon left. You know, it's just a bunch of minerals. It's ash, essentially. So it's not a very good mulch.
Questions about this mister.
Overhead.
What is the actual water use, the gallons per minute? How do you time it with actual irrigation? Is the idea that you pre-irrigate before the heat event and use the mister during? And cost per acre?
Okay, cost of overhead misters, and these are not really misters, they're actually drops that are coming out. So you really want to coat the leaf, and you want to have a heavy enough drop that lands there and not blows off. So these systems were running about $1,200 an acre, and you figure you amortize it over 10 years, $120 an acre. It's cheap. You want to anticipate the event and start running it when temperature's starting to get in the 90s or so, and you're using the forecast, and you're running it during that period of heat event, and you're rotating it through. So for example, this one guy in Ohio was running it about every 45 minutes, coming around. He had 5 different irrigation blocks. And so he was running it for about an hour and then running it to the next system. And they were running at about 1,000 gallons per acre per hour. So you're running it for 4 or 5 hours. You know, it's going to take some water. You have to have on-demand water use. Ken?
One quick follow-up on that. So the height that they are started at, then what happens when these trees grow? How do you adjust?
Okay, so this is 2 different people. Both of them had the emission occurring overhead. One was at least 6 to 8 feet above. That was on mature trees that were about 12 feet high. The young trees, they were still about 8 feet above the trees in anticipation of growth.